All right, ladies, I think let's get this started. So thank you to all of you who are joining us. My name is Dolly Singh. I'm the founder of Thesis Couture. Our mission has always been about uplifting the voices of brilliant women, and this is kind of an extension of that. So I'm super excited today to be joined by two amazing women, Moujan Kaserani and Rebecca Umbach. We shared their bios with you guys in advance, so I'll spare you repeating them. But if you haven't checked them out on LinkedIn, I would definitely recommend it. And I'm very excited to talk with both of these ladies today. I'm going to do similar to what we did in the last session in terms of format. I'm going to do a one-on-one Q&A with each of the ladies, and then we're going to jump into some group discussions. So for one-on-one Q&A, I'm going to kick it off with Miss Rebecca. Rebecca, your background, obviously super interesting. I'd love to know how you got into criminology in the first place. How did it become your passion originally?
Sure. I guess I will say that I was always that kid that was watching CSI and Law and Order as a child, so it maybe was not that big of a surprise. But when I went to Penn, I started off intending to major in journalism and sort of took all the classes around that. And then luckily for me, the general education requirement sort of sprouted up, and I took this biosocial criminology class with my eventual supervisor my sophomore year, and I just fell in love with it, was obsessed with it, worked in his lab as a research assistant, and then switched my major sort of at the end of that semester once I realized that I really loved thinking about the dark and the twisty. And so I sort of took a weird route from broadcast journalism into criminology, but have not looked back since then. So did my master's at Penn and my PhD at Penn. They have all my money. And then I came out of there and went to a postdoc.
That's amazing. My daughter's kind of obsessed with horror movies, and it kind of freaks me out because it's not my thing. So at least good to know that something good might come from this at some point. But then, you know, when I think of people that do user research at Google, I would never have imagined a PhD criminologist landing into that role. So how did that transition happen? Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I wasn't necessarily expecting to go into industry. A lot of PhD programs sort of essentially assume that you're going to go into academia from them. So I went and started my postdoc, which was this essentially a mashup of child development and substance use and substance misuse diseases. So I was sort of in that, and I was really enjoying that. The lab was great, but it sort of just made me realize that in academia, you can do a lot of work and not necessarily touch a ton of people. But if I go into something like a job at Google, then I can help make those decisions that sort of shape the experience for the user. And I can really help try to protect vulnerable populations, especially given how predominant cybercrime is becoming. So I definitely think that I'm a bit of a strange fit at Google, but it seems to have worked pretty well. And since I'm in the trust and safety space, it matches better than you might suspect to be a criminologist.
Okay, amazing. And I actually found you through some research that I did. So in the last session, as we were going through the discussion, one of the things I thought about was whether or not there are any parallels between like what happens to the human brain through the experience of incarceration and how that may or may not relate to some of the things that we're going through. Now, we had a pre-conversation in the lead up to this discussion where you made it really clear that there are some things that may, but it's a completely different segment and a very different experience. So can you tell us a little bit about that research?
Sure. I should first premise this with the fact that this is really the baby, the brainchild of this incredible mentor of mine, Dr. Noelle Leonard. She's a professor at NYU. And she was interested in how incarceration affects the brain. And there's been a lot of theorizing around this. Obviously, considering the amount of incarceration that we have in this country, people are interested in sort of what the effects are on a more sort of individual level as opposed to just societal. But very few people had actually empirically studied it and tried to test those effects. So what she managed to do was get permission to go into Rikers Island, which is a facility in New York City. You may have heard of it. And she looked at this very specific subset of that population, which was essentially 16 to 18-year-old juvenile males. And she looked at the subset because we know that the brain is very plastic, even into your teens and your early 20s. And so part of the hypothesizing around this is that negative effects from environment might have a more significant effect on these kids, essentially, who still have these really plastic brains. And so what they did essentially was they took a baseline measurement of using these different cognitive tests of how they were performing on these tasks. And then they split them into two groups. One was the experimental group, which was this combination of cognitive behavioral therapy and mindfulness. And then the other was sort of the control group, which just received the normal I think it was like, it's normal educational programming, but it doesn't have anything to do with sort of cognitive control or psychological issues, essentially. And then they went back essentially, and after the intervention had ended, they measured essentially the difference from the baseline. And what they found was that both of the groups declined, but it was really only significant for the control group who had not received the CBT mindfulness intervention. So what they found was that incarceration does have negative effects on the brain, which may be not surprising to anybody, but had not necessarily been empirically shown. And B, that if you administer some sort of intervention that's designed to buffer those potential effects, then it actually does have some sort of positive effect.
Okay, amazing, super interesting. Now, talk to me a little bit about, do you think that there are lessons to be learned as it relates to cognitive behavioral therapy and some of the methodologies used there? In terms of like managing your own executive functioning skills almost, that you think can be applicable to all of us that are now dealing with not incarceration, but certainly some level of isolation and a huge deviation from what our normal day-to-day operations were, right? So are there lessons to be learned that can help us as coping strategies that come directly from the field of psychology and understanding the human mind?
Yeah, I mean, in our pre-conversation, I did sort of strongly clarify that what we're doing right now, this self-isolation, this quarantine, there are obviously some parallels. We're not necessarily able to see our loved ones or our friends. We're not interacting in the same way. And there is probably a strong sense of loss of autonomy because we're being told by the government and by public health officials that in order to help protect people, we need to, live our life in a very specific way. So there are some parallels there. Obviously, incarcerated persons have much stronger loss of autonomy, et cetera. So it is an interesting comparison to make. I think that in terms of thinking of the lessons of the CBT mindfulness therapy, what it was really designed to do was for the teenagers, the youth, to identify the situations, the negative situations that they would get into and how they would react to them, and to essentially try to pivot their behavior to avoid those situations and to avoid sort of the negative antisocial possibilities. And then the other fact was to focus on the positives. And so to remove yourself from those stressful situations, and then to also sort of reappraise the situations that you've been in and try to pull out the positives from that. So and then some of it was just getting in tune with your own feelings. I think a lot of us go through life sort of feeling things, but tamping it down. And part of the main part of mindfulness is essentially to feel how you're feeling and acknowledge how you're feeling and not try to control it. So like let yourself feel stressed and panicked and acknowledge that it's normal. So I think that those for me are sort of the big lessons, and it doesn't have to be in such a structured way. There's so many resources out there right now that are supposed to help you with mindfulness. And I think the main takeaway is essentially trying to manage your stress, to acknowledge your stress, and then to manage it as best you can. So whether that's, exercising or making sure you get enough sleep or indulging in this mindfulness practice, all of those things would work. And I think it's also useful to think about what works for you personally, as opposed to just taking my advice, for example.
Fabulous. Okay, now let me get into kind of a trickier topic that we talked a little bit about. And I really wanted to get more of your perspective on. So I've actually got some data. I'm going to read this off of my chart so I don't misrepresent anything. Data that relates to both the US prison system, right? And then data that relates specifically to the current COVID-19 crisis. So on the prison system, the US represents about 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prisoners. The prison population has increased about 600% in the last 40 years. And Black and Brown Americans are jailed at a rate of 5 times their white peers, and they face harshly different circumstances when it comes to sentencing. And then there's data on COVID-19, which also shows some significant trends in terms of racial disparities. So Black Americans are 2 times more likely than white Americans and 3 times more likely than Asian Americans to die from COVID-19. Latino Americans are 1.5 times more likely than their white counterparts and 2 times more likely than their Asian counterparts to die from COVID-19. And Black and Latino Americans are just statistically more likely to be lower income, which often results in lower quality healthcare access, lower quality access to proper food, diet, and nutrition, often resulting in more comorbidities, all of which becomes these impacting forces, these layers of oppression that a lot of times many of us who don't suffer from them don't see them. So I would wonder what your perspective is on both what you've seen in terms of your study around criminology and those racial disparities, and how those same disparities are being uncovered by the current crisis? Are there any through lines that you see or think about?
I mean, I think that this current crisis is hopefully exposing the inequities that minorities and Black and brown people are feeling in terms of access to healthcare and to healthy food and to jobs that don't necessarily require them to put themselves in the line of fire. So in terms of thinking about lessons, I think that what's clear is that this COVID has had a disparate effect on Black and brown people, and that Black and brown people are also more likely to be in prison. So we see that this sort of explosive exponential risk for those people who are currently incarcerated. I think what is interesting to think about is sort of what natural experiments, for lack of a better word, this could result in. So one example that I like to think about is that the Philadelphia DA decided to eliminate essentially cash bail for low-level offenders. And they've studied that and tested to see whether that has any changes in people showing up to court. Does that have changes in them offending between that time when they essentially are released and between when they have to show up for court? All these things where it's like, okay, well, by doing this, we're letting people back out onto the streets. Is that bad? How can we think about that? And they didn't find any sort of negative repercussions of that. And we know that essentially Black and brown people are also less likely to be able to make things like bail. So in some ways, this is kind of replicating that experiment in a lot of cities where they've realized that prisons are a hotbed for contagion. And so they're allowing people to be released out onto the streets if they've deemed them low-level offenders. And I can imagine that data scientists and police departments are really looking forward to that data, because we can finally test something that was essentially an exogenous shock to the system, forcing people to be released when they wouldn't necessarily have been in the past. So it's an opportunity, I think, to think about essentially who actually needs to be incarcerated, and are there alternative systems of justice that are both less deleterious to the person over the long term and also, frankly, cheaper to the American taxpayer. It's the one thing that both sides of the political spectrum can kind of align on, because it's expensive and it's also obviously very unequally applied to different races.
Well, and I would say the intersection of these things clearly impacts Black and brown people, but this is where the broken system actually impacts everybody in a really profound way, right? So most of us live our day-to-day lives. We don't think about the US prison system. They're intentionally placed, far away to where they're out of sight, out of mind. But this crisis in particular is deeply impacted by what's broken in the prison system, right? Because what they're finding now is most of these hotspots, many of these hotspots, are associated with proximity to prison populations, because it's not just the prisoners that are impacted. The staff in those facilities will then get infected as well and carry those infections to their communities when they go grocery shopping, when they take their kids somewhere, et cetera, et cetera. So our lack of concern about the brokenness of the US prison system has been something that's been easy to ignore for a long time. And this really significant health crisis, I would hope on some level at least forces us to take a much closer look at that system than we have before, because it's much harder to ignore if it becomes a statistical risk factor for how we control and manage this epidemic, which clearly isn't going away anytime soon, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very cynical, where I agree with you right now that I hope that this is making guards and visitors, if they're still getting to visit, really careful about making sure that prisoners can do what they can to protect themselves, because obviously the source of contagion is not the prisoners themselves, it's the people coming in and bringing it to them. So they're this sitting ducks essentially for COVID, and especially considering that it's not going to be super easy for them to get quick and necessary medical treatment if they go into something like heart failure. So I agree with you that it's potentially going to be interesting to see whether the criminal justice system really thinks about how this works for the community surrounding these carceral facilities. But I'm very cynical in thinking that, honestly, as soon as a vaccine happens, I worry that this will sort of fade back into the background. So it's really an impetus right now, even though there's so much happening that we're worried about, to include this on those lists of things that we should be thinking about, and thinking about how COVID has exposed these flaws in the system.
And do you have input on how people can be better allies and just more aware of these issues, that how the criminal justice system in the country does or doesn't impact all of us on a day-to-day basis, and how we can contribute to helping improve the potential outlook of that system over at least the long term, if not the short term?
I mean, I think a lot of it is awareness. So if you've ever listened to Ear Hustle, it's a podcast that I really recommend. It's produced out of San Quentin Prison, I believe. And
Okay.
it's an incarcerated person and a woman who comes in to do the recording, and they talk about all these issues within prison. So I think one of the big things for Americans is to really humanize incarcerated people and to realize that they are people, and also that they're mostly going to be getting out. And so if we are doing things that impact their brains and make them less likely to be able to inhibit their impulses, and that we don't give them job training, like what do you think that people are going to do if they have no options once they're released, like if they have no job history, if they have no skills? So I think a big part of it is humanizing them and realizing that just as COVID is spreading in our communities, there are people who are coming out of prison and they're coming into our communities, and if we want them to succeed, then we need to make sure that there are resources for them to do so. So one of the big things I think that's happening and that Google's actually providing some funding for is testing of the programs that are in prisons. So prisons are, federal and there's state prisons, and there's different levels of resources amongst all of those. And so one of the questions is, whichever prison you get sent to, there might be hugely different kinds of resources available to you. So making sure that there are like good education systems and good job skills training, I think, I don't know how we can affect that, but it's just something that I think people can be aware of. And then there are great programs on the outside that you can support. There's actually a restaurant in San Francisco that intentionally hires at-risk youth and youth who have like served time in juvenile detention and given them on the job like skills training. So I think maybe looking into those kinds of resources on the outside and trying to support them however you can, whether it's financially or with your time, is sort of what I would suggest.
Okay, no, that's amazing. And that gives me one last quick question for you. Do you think that big tech has a role to play in fixing some of these large societal problems, right? Google, Facebook, Amazon, et cetera, all, Goliaths of industry. But sometimes they stand on the sidelines on some of these societal issues, which as a corporate entity within a capitalist structure, maybe is the right thing for them to be doing. So what's your perspective, or whatever extent you're comfortable sharing that, on what role both big tech and big business should or shouldn't play as it relates to kind of solving some of our societal issues, particularly in a time where this is one of the things I'm going to be looking forward to talking to Moujan about, where leadership, there appears to be a gap in leadership, right? So is that an opportunity for big tech and big business to help fill that gap?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's happening piecemeal. So I would say that Google.org, which is Google's sort of philanthropic arm, is doing some work around data organizing. So one thing that's sort of missing is we have so many people coming in and leaving prisons. And again, there's different essentially jurisdictions of prisons. And so there is publicly available data, but it's very hard to query that and to do analyses on that and to look at it in any sort of systematic way. So I think that Google and other big tech's ability to organize data in a useful way so that we can actually test, for example, which programs work, what the recidivism rates of like specific prisons are, whether there's like higher rates of violence within one prison versus another, will help actually criminal justice hold itself accountable. So speaking of Rikers, they actually were investigated, I think, by the Southern District of New York, and they found the systemic violence throughout the system. And that was one of the reasons why there's this big call to shut down Rikers. So I think that helping keep track of data and making sure that data is logged and then making that accessible to people so that they can actually see what's going on the inside is something that tech can help with. Another big thing is sort of coding. So we have volunteer programs where people can help go into I've heard it's fascinating, actually. They can go into prisons and they'll help people build websites without actual access to internet. So they'll do, because in a lot of times prisoners don't have access to internet. So they're trying to give them transferable job skills, which might also be especially easy because you can, or good rather, because you can do coding jobs from anywhere. So if you have to live with your grandma in, Iowa, then you can still theoretically do a tech coding job from there. So I think thinking about the restrictions that are placed on incarcerated people after they're released and how we can sort of help them, again, develop job skills training so that they feel like they have an option is someplace that big tech can really push for.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for that. I'm going to pivot, Moujan, briefly to you, because I think you have a lot to say as it relates, and a lot of power from an industry standpoint in terms of setting the tone on what big tech and big business can do on the capital side. So let me first actually ask you to tell everybody a little bit about your really remarkable career journey. I mean, you've got such a remarkable story that I'd love for you to just give everybody a little bit of an overview and kind of walk us through step by step on how you have arrived at this point in your career?
Sure. Thanks for having me. I'm going to be dating myself, but I'll go through it nevertheless. I started my career at Gibson Dunn, which is a global law firm headquartered here in LA. Then went on to be general counsel at TrueCar with Scott Painter and his team, and loved being part of the management team. I was then recruited by Jeff Stibel to become head of legal and compliance at Dun& Bradstreet Credibility. And then soon after that, we had a lot of fun running D&B. And I went on to, after we merged with Dun& Bradstreet, and essentially I went on to lead strategy for Dun& Bradstreet. And for the past 3 years, we've been running Bryant Stibel as a management team full time. So we essentially exited D&B and went on to run this platform, which has been really an incredible experience.
Amazing. So one of the things that I have been appreciative of in my career is those moments where I've taken a calculated risk that has paid off. So talk to me a little bit about like when those forks in the roads happened, right? Like maybe the first time you were recruited by Jeff, like where were those inflection points and how did you make those decisions and how did you jump off the cliff even if it was scary in that moment?
Yes. So, you know what? I will tell you that on the personal front, like many other women, I had to make pretty tough decision of going back to work after having each of my kids. And I think most women can relate to how difficult that decision is, regardless of where you are in your career or what you're doing and what your circumstances are. Um, and I think that in each case, I had really just incredible opportunities, which helped, I think, tip the scale in a lot of ways. And I was lucky to have that choice too, because I know that as difficult as it is for everyone to kind of have to go back to work or not go back to work, depending on their circumstances, having a choice really is a privilege. Professionally, I will say transitioning between the law firm, being at Gibson Dunn and having sort of, everything there for me and deciding to go in-house was a big decision. Um, and I think that the other big decision that I had, and I really loved going in-house and being part of a team and really getting deep into the company and operations of the company, and love being able to not only help legally, but also be able to really foresee risks, et cetera, and help out from everywhere from marketing to sales to partner development and such. And the other big transition, I think, for me was um, really going from the legal role to this investor advisor role at this, at the venture and growth platform at Bryant Stibel. Um, we sort of slowly came to that, and I think we started investing together, which was fun, but doing it full time, helping entrepreneurs and helping different companies has been really amazing. But that was a big pivotal moment for me, basically being able to just continue on the path that I had been on, or take a new path, something new, learn, and start in a new direction. It's been great.
Okay, amazing. So one of the things I'm actually surprised to hear you say is that you had, not that it was a hard decision deciding to come back to work. I get that piece. But for me, when I see you, you have this grace and this confidence that I really admire. And a lot of times the questions that I get, so one of the things I do is I lead an ERG team within a tech company.
Mm.
And one of the things that we constantly get a lot of questions on is this idea of like imposter syndrome, right? Like feeling like you belong and kind of like this idea of strengthen your own voice and feeling like your seat at the table belongs to you and you earned it. So have you always had, like, is your confidence something that's innate and you always had it, or have you built it through experience and through those interactions?
I think 100% through experience and interactions. And I think, unfortunately for as women, sometimes we have a hard time listening to our own voice and gut. And um, and until we really gain our own confidence, like true confidence in ourselves, we're not able to do that. And that's kind of one of the biggest problems, right? A lot of times we're looking at other people, we're looking for direction, et cetera, or confirmation for what we're able to do. Whereas, we have all that right here with all of our experiences and what we've been through. Um, I think that, the society itself, I mean, I hate to get into these things, but it's hard not to. There's this sort of negative perception of that confidence that comes out for female executives, and we see it all the time. I also ran culture for a time at Dun& Bradstreet, so I can talk really clearly about this, that constantly there's this notion of sort of being too assertive, too bossy, et cetera, for women, where you never see that coming coming across, for men. And if you do these reviews, you'll see this over and over again. And I think that a lot of times that also comes from other women. So I think we need to sort of confront those stereotypes, talk about them, be open to them. Let's not hide them, under carpets, and be comfortable in our own skin, so that we can join. And it's not just other women, but join women, men, et cetera, to sort of make that change. And we're lucky because I think there's a lot of movements in that direction right now, but I still worry that it's going to come to a halt, and has come to a halt somewhat with sort of the new crisis and other things that we're now faced with. And a lot of times during these difficult times, it's the people with less, typically societally less power, sort of what we talked about, whether it's, brown, Black people, minorities, et cetera, and women as well, that it affects most.
Absolutely. I think it was what you said reminded me, I think it's a Madeleine Albright quote where she said, "There's a special place in hell for women that don't help other women." I remember hearing that and I was like, yes, that's the quote. And that's definitely something I've also struggled with. I think there's this perception amongst women sometimes that there's only one seat at the table. So we have to fight for that seat. And I think that's so terribly backwards, right? Like we should be fighting the guys to get a second seat at the table
Together,
for
yes.
us, right? So
Yes.
I think if we don't do that, then we're always fighting over one seat, and we'll always be 1 out of 10. And I think that'll be a sad place to be, if we stay there for too long. So,
Agreed.
Agree 100%, right? So talk
Yes.
a little bit about how Bryant Stibel was founded, kind of what the vision for the firm was, and tell me a little bit about the origin story of the fund.
Yes. So interestingly enough, and I think I kind of alluded to this earlier, as a management team, while we were running at Dun & Bradstreet Credibility, we were also investing together. And it was just a fun side thing that we were doing, but we were doing well. And when Kobe Bryant and Jeff Stibel met, they actually realized that they had a lot more in common than any of us would think. And so we set out to sort of invest in some great companies together, with the same vision of helping entrepreneurs, athletes, and building a great platform across the board.
Okay, amazing.
I do think that it's interesting to note that Bryant Stibel is a little different from most firms because our focus is where we can bring the most value to an investment. So where we go in as an entire team, marketing, sales, finance, legal, product, et cetera, and help the company sort of, I would say, unlock a value that they may not have even known existed. And in fact, when we actually evaluate prospects, we have this internal projections that we do, which shows what they will be doing with our help, what they can achieve with our help. And I think in that sense, the partnerships that we make, the portfolio companies we work with, would say it's an amazing partnership all around.
Okay, I love that. I actually, to fill anybody that's listening in, I joined an office hours that your team did. And one of the things I was really impressed with was the different dimensions that each member of the team had. And yet the very insightful input you guys were able to provide. And so that really demonstrated to me like the beauty of diversity in teams, period, right? So like one of the things that as a talent leader that I think is important is this idea of cognitive diversity, right? That the best ideas fundamentally come from more diverse teams, right? This has been validated in study after study, right?
100%.
So how do we help executives, founders, the ecosystem, which still is very traditionally white and male, how do we help them understand that it's not in our benefit to hire us or to elevate us or to uplift us? It is actually in your benefit as much as it is in our benefit. So how do we how do we get that message through to leaders that matter?
I think it's important to us for two things. One is that it needs to be organic, and we have to look for the best people to complete our team as opposed to going out and trying to make a diverse team. I think that's a mistake a lot of people make, is that they're looking for a certain gender, certain, something specific just to make themselves diverse, as opposed to looking for, how am I going to make this team? What are the best parts of this team? And how can we bring a team together? And when you do that, it will organically be diverse, which is what happened to us. And I think it is an incredible story that we like to talk about. We like to show and sort of help mirror to others, because we didn't go out for this to happen. We looked for people to complete our team. And that's what we try to do within portfolio companies and things as well, where we go in and we essentially show them that when you come in, and we have these deconstructions that we do, where we sit around with a company and deconstruct the business. And when their management team is sitting with ours, they can see how it flows, right? What the diversity of interactions and people, from gender to, minorities being on the team, et cetera, affect how we see things. Because it's, most companies are selling to a group of consumers, whether it's businesses or, actual consumers that are diverse like we are. They're not selling to just one type of people. And I think that's a lot of times missing, because all people see is what they themselves would like or prefer or see or do. And in looking for how to best sell your products, how to best market your product, et cetera, you really need to have that diversity.
Okay, fabulous. Now, 2020 has been, I think, a landmark year for all of us, right? So it's like the year of the Black Swan. For you guys, it's, I think, that much more difficult. So how is it that you're all still standing, frankly, right? And what can we learn from that, right? Being able to walk through fire is kind of what every day feels like to us, but it's nothing in comparison to people that are dealing with grief, loss, right? And now we have almost 100,000 people dead in this country. So this is a huge national tragedy. So how do you walk through fire and still find a way to face the next day?
I think it's certainly been a year for us already, and I think we're only halfway through it. And I think it's really hard to recover from that kind of loss. So I'm not going to downplay it. But really, that's where leadership really matters most, right? Because when you think about the tough times, the times that you really need to get there in the trenches, this is the time. And I have to say, I'm learning a lot day to day from some great entrepreneurs that we work with, that are working pretty hard to pivot their businesses. They're making really tough decisions and moving forward. And I think it's the most important time to be there for the teams, for our teams, for portfolio companies, for friends and family, and actually sit there with them and with the decisions that they're making and learn from them, and sort of give as much advice as we can where we can, and know that we don't know everything. We have to sort of embrace this unknown, because no one knows what the recovery timeline is going to be. We don't know what the curve is going to look like. We have never seen something like this before. No one's seen it. So we have to listen, adapt, pivot, and try to make sense of the day-to-day decisions that we have to make. And fortunately, I think times like this also bring about a lot of opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we need to really pay attention to be able to see them, because a lot of times they pass us right by, because we're so into what's going on in the day to day. And I think with that, it pays to be entrepreneurial and sort of look where you haven't looked before, and take leaps where you can.
So that reminds me a little bit of some of what we talked about with Rebecca, right? Like, how do we use this crisis to kind of deal with some of our demons that have been, or like these cancers that have been in our society for a while, that we have managed to look away from and ignore? What's your perspective on what the venture and the ecosystem around money and capital being provided to businesses? What's the role that you guys play in terms of creating the impact necessary to build a world that's better post-COVID and better, period, right? Acknowledging the inequities that are now more clear than ever.
I think we have to be optimistic. I really do. I think we have to be optimistic. We have to listen to each other. We have to learn from mistakes that have been made in the past. I think it's very important to do that. I think it's easy to ignore those and ignore the past directions. And then again, like this whole unknown, you're not waiting for something. You're not waiting for something to happen. You're not, you can't anticipate. So you got to move. You got to move and you got to do things. And I think the more we look at the future in an optimistic way of what can we do? What are the things that are, what is this teaching us, right? When we're all taking this step back. And I think it's been, as difficult as it has been, it's also been very sobering. It's also been a chance to step back and take a pause and actually look at things in a different way, which we never would have. And I think there's going to be a lot of good that ultimately comes out of it because of that. I really do. I think that it would be a shame if we didn't take some of these opportunities and some of these changes and challenges and make something from it that's positive in the future.
Now, I agree, but I'm more of a cynic like Rebecca, because I feel like if the last 8 weeks or 10 weeks are anything to show of like what level of national leadership we could expect through the rest of the crisis, it makes me less hopeful that we're going to take real lessons away from this. I have more hope, honestly. Like, I am a capitalist, so I believe in business, that business can be both good for the world and good for the entrepreneur. So I kind of have more faith in our tech ecosystem as it relates to innovation, and in some of our business leaders in terms of them being able to like make contributions, than of the leadership that I've seen coming out of our administration.
The federal government.
That's my personal perspective, obviously, and I'm sure folks will disagree, but I've been deeply disappointed. And so that makes me very cynical, right? About our actual ability to realize real opportunity in this. So how do you think we can find the silver linings while we're still kind of adrift with no real strategy?
But I think that's exactly what's leading to a lot of corporations and top technology entrepreneurs and such coming out of the woodwork and actually taking action. I think before they were in the background, letting the government sort of do what it's going to do. But the failure has been so grand that if you look at how many businessmen, businesswomen, entrepreneurs, just influencers have come out to actually work and do something to make a change, I think that's actually very positive. And I think you're also seeing a lot of sort of international unity in the sense, because, and look, aside from what's going on in the government, but when you look around, all of us are experiencing the same thing, right? Whether you're here, whether you're in Asia, in Europe, etc. And I think that's brought a lot of unity. It's brought a lot of businesses together. It's brought a lot of, I would actually say it's brought a lot of mentorships and a lot of companies talking to each other, even talking to competitors and trying to align on what the future holds for that sector, etc. And also come together to support each other. I've never seen so much support for whether it's for companies, entrepreneurs, for people. Mm-hmm. And I think those are the things that we have to be optimistic about. I mean, there's no doubt that this is going to be a long haul, and it's not going to be easy. And there's going to be a lot of things that we're going to see happen as time goes by. That's going to be much more devastating than it is today with time. But what we have to do is take something from it, come together. And I have seen, I mean, even just these kinds of things that we're doing today, I'm seeing so much more of that, so much more people trying to reach out to others and, going outside of their own communities, which a lot of times, wasn't happening. I don't know about you guys, but a lot of times, even the group events and things that you were going to was local. Mm-hmm. And now just 2 days ago, I was in a sort of a group conference, and there were people all over the place from Europe, etc., women coming together. And I think that's incredible.
Okay, so there are silver linings. I'm gonna,
yes, 100%.
I think,
I'm an optimist, so
I usually am too. But I think I still have faith in humanity, but I've definitely lost faith in like the system over the last few years. Like for me, I'm an immigrant. So, and they say immigrants make the best patriots, because
with you.
coming from a country where I would be some random girl in an Indian village, probably married by the time I was 18 and had, you know, be seen as nothing more than really a uterus to be, you know, like bartered essentially. By the stroke of luck of being here, that's not my life. I've had so many remarkable opportunities, right? I've lived a life that my mother and my grandmother could only dream of. And so like, I was that person that every 4th of July, when like, you know, the patriotic songs come on, I'm like crying in the corner, because it really like means that like American values meant that much to me. And watching them kind of be shredded by the person who's supposed to hold them most sacred, I have found deeply offensive, frankly. And, you know, like when this administration took over the first time, my instinct was, yo, I'm going to move. I'm going to go to Italy. I'm going to New Zealand. I'm going somewhere. But my friends who are smart, amazing women said, look, if every ally and every advocate of what's right leaves and runs for the hills, what will be left of our country, right? And then you're like, oh shit, that's the wrong thing to do, to run for the hills. But yo, I don't know, I might have to run for the hills this time, because like the day-to-day anxiety and stress of just watching the things that you hold so near and dear, right? Even though they're abstracts, right? Because the idea of ethics and the idea of American democracy isn't a thing. It's like a concept in our brains, right? So this goes back to some of what we learned from Rebecca. It's like stuff that we have, this model that we've created in our mind. So just watching, it's like watching the Matrix be ripped apart, but it was a Matrix that I really liked, you know? So it's super, it's hard to not be discouraged, frankly, in this climate. That's what I have found myself personally struggling with, is trying to stay encouraged and optimistic in the day-to-day onslaught of like the insanity that seems to be never ending, right? From drinking bleach to like the next thing.
I know, believe me, I'm, you know, as a fellow immigrant, I'm with you in more ways than one. I 100% agree, but I think at the same time, at least I'm hopeful that others are people who weren't seeing that before,
Yes.
when it wasn't blatant and in their face, maybe they're seeing it today. And I don't know, again, it's the optimistic side of me, so maybe it's not happening, but I do see the numbers sort of changing, right? I do see little bits of movement in places where I think that could potentially lead to some change in the federal government, whether it's with the, you know, how high up or where. We are, you know, still yet to see, but there has been movement, which there hadn't been in a very long time. And I think there's more voices of an opposition coming out. And at the same time, I think another really important thing is that aside from the government and what's going on, what I see with people and how much they're coming together, that's very, you know, it's very positive and enlightening. And it could have gone both ways. I mean, there was a time where I felt like it almost was tipping a little bit the other way, and it's changed. And I also like to see my kids. I've enjoyed seeing them go. I mean, you know, obviously difficult thing to go through, etc. And not all positive in any way. But there is this joy of seeing them make it through the struggles, adapt to the changes, recognize sort of the privileges and, you know, all those things that we have that that maybe you and I recognize as immigrants coming to the United States as children, but our kids have not experienced before.
Yes.
So you know, there's that, and there's some light.
Yes, I mean, that is certainly where I do hold my optimism, right? And it's part of what started my journey as an entrepreneur. It's that I believe you have to see her to be her. So I don't want my daughter to grow up thinking that she needs to just go work for some other amazing founder that's building a great business. But I want her to see a world where she can be that founder building a great business, right? And so yes, I think small steps, and it's a marathon and not a sprint. So let me pivot. We've got about 10 minutes left briefly to our discussion items. So on this one, those of you guys who are watching on the live stream, I'm going to introduce the concept of like using binary to comment. So I'm a geek, so I like things that are nerdy. So most of you guys probably know code is written in zeros and ones. So if you want to comment on the live stream, use a 0 for like disagreement and use a 1 as like a +1 for things that you might agree with. So my first question, and Rebecca, I'm going to ask you to kick us off, is things are starting to open back up, right? The world is opening. How safe do you feel, and how, like, when are you going to be ready to go to like a restaurant? That's my big question for everybody. When are you going to go sit down to other humans that you don't know within close proximity and eat your food?
I'm a stat wonk, so I will say that being in San Francisco, I feel like I'm in a pretty privileged position.
Yeah.
Our rates are quite low relative to LA and to other places. So I would say that I don't feel immediately at risk every time I go outside. I do not anticipate going to sit down in a restaurant anytime in the next 2 to 3 months.
Okay, I'm the same. I'm like, I'm not going to be the first guinea pig. But Moujan, obviously, as capitalists, we want to support our local economy. So I'm very torn on this issue, right? Like, do I support my local businesses, or do I like try to be as safe as possible? What's your perspective? When do we get to go out to restaurants?
I would say forget restaurants. At least we can still order in. What about getting a haircut? I think it's interesting. I mean, you're sort of hearing everything, right? I mean, I have some friends who have already gone and done like a million things, right? Meanwhile, we're still trying to order even our groceries so that we don't have to go inside a grocery store. So I think it's different with everyone's comforts are different. I think the important thing is to sort of respect that, especially with going back to work. There's a lot out there right now about when to go back to work and how, and we have to be cognizant that there are people that have pre-existing conditions. They have people who have families with them, living with them, and we may not know that. So I think those all come into play. Restaurants themselves, I mean, I definitely low on my list of things to get back to, including gyms. I think those, we've realized we can do a lot of it at home, and as much as you like to help your local communities, I think those are unfortunately on the lower scale and the higher risk scale. So it's going to be a slow roll back, I think.
I agree. Yes. I mean, I'm a foodie, so restaurants are my thing, right? Like gym, I do my squats at home. I don't like people watching me work out. It kind of freaks me out. So not big, like most other human interactions, I can probably stay away, but I really loved, like, we did it only once or twice a week, right? But like taking my kids, going out and having a nice meal, watching a movie. It was like, we're low key. We don't need to do fancy things, but just the opportunity to like go out into the world and not feel scared. I'm like waiting for that moment, and I don't know when that moment will arrive, actually. Let me jump to the next question briefly. And so Moujan, I'll have you kick this one off. What are you personally doing to stay mentally and physically fit during this time?
Well, I'm a big workout addict, so this is a good one for me. I work out every morning. It's a habit that I have, and I used to go to different gyms, and it was a difficult sort of transition to not having all my different places to go to. But again, look at all these gyms and local Pilates places, from yoga to everything, having online places. So I get to see the same instructor I always took for my Pilates twice a week, and my favorite yoga instructors online. And I do a lot of HIIT. I love the Peloton. I like to be active as much as I can be.
Okay, so exercise is your trick.
Exercise, that's it.
Oh, sorry. The science would support Moujan's, so bravo. I would say that I've been doing a lot of baking, so probably my mental fitness is.
But nobody can find flour.
Yeah, I bought a 10-pound bag of flour, and we're like over halfway through it. So I've been doing a lot of baking. Also the workout classes. I'm a big fan of being able to humiliate myself doing like Zumba and hip hop classes in the privacy of my own home. And then I've been trying to read a lot. I just feel like I see screens all the time now, and you don't even get the break of like a commute or whatever. So I'm trying to read more books. So.
Okay, fabulous. All right. So now this will lead us back to one of our earlier discussions. I would hope that the world coming out of this crisis is brighter and better than the one going into it. So what's the one silver lining that you're really looking and hoping to see let's say a year, 2 years from now? Something that either sticks so we keep it, right, from the crisis era, or something that changes post-crisis era?
Oh, goodness. I think that what Moujan said about and what my friends have said too about working from home and being understanding of people's issues that might make them want to work more at home. I think that this has been essentially, again, a big natural experiment to see how productive and how effectively we can work from home. I'm not saying that I want to exclusively work from home, but I think that this might enable and encourage companies to have more liberal policies. And I think especially for people with families or with young children at home, that kind of flexibility will hopefully allow people to sort of explore in a way that they hadn't been able to when they were tied to a desk.
I'm going to plus one that. My sister's a single mom. She works for Apple, great company to work for. And this is, like she said, this is the first time she has felt like at peace with her responsibilities and duties of being a single parent and working for a high performance company, because like through forcing function, essentially, like you have to trust people and you have to be KPI focused, right? So absolutely agree with that 1,000%. Moujan, what about you?
Agree with that as well. I think especially for women, I think all across the board, this has been a real positive on that side for women, as companies realize that, people are just as productive, if not more productive. I think for me, it's also been the pause and the time to, with everything getting canceled. My husband and I used to do sort of the high five on the weekends, like you're on this, 2 hours away, soccer field, I'm on the other side. And it's been nice to have the time for family, for connections. And it's interesting, I found a lot of different connections that I wouldn't have, I think, otherwise. And talking to people who I would normally not, because I don't see them on a day-to-day, but now with Zoom and everything else being so much more normalized, I'm actually reconnecting. So I hope that lasts for not just for me, but for everyone. Okay,
I love those. Those are two very hopeful and optimistic answers. So I'm going to ask you guys each one more question and then we'll be all wrapped up. So I'm a shoe freak. People that know me know this.
Shoes, really?
Like a kind of a quasi shoe question, but if you could walk in the shoes of any woman, present or past, on any one day or for any one occasion, who would that woman be and what would the day be? And to give you guys a couple more seconds to think of your answer. So for me, I think I would want to be Michelle Obama on the day that Barack was elected the first time, because I can only imagine how good it would feel to be like, you were my intern and I have now turned you into the president of the United States. So like what level of accomplishment, how much of a more badass kingmaker could you ever be? And like how much her heart must have swelled with pride on that day, because for me, far away, just to see a brown family on that stage was like, oh my God, I was a mess. So that would be my day and my woman. Rebecca, what about you?
Oh, go to Moujan.
You're like, don't ask me first. Don't ask me first.
I will go, but I mean, look, just off the first thing, I'm just going to go with like the first thing that came to my mind was Sandra Day O'Connor. And I think, for me as an attorney and having her in the, in the Supreme Court was so huge, and so much has come from it. And I can't pinpoint any particular day, but I will say for sure, so many of her days. And I will also go on record to say that I have thought of her and how important it is for her to stay healthy during this time, not once, pretty often during this time.
Well, that's like, I pray for Ruth Bader Ginsburg every night when I go to bed. I'm like, somebody bubble wrap her and make sure that she's okay.
But it's just like, there's some people that, way back when were able to accomplish so many things. And the fact that they existed and they did what they did and they were that one person, the only person to be representative of a different group of people. And there's been many others, but, they make a big impression and you're always thinking of them during times like this where so much is happening and things can turn in any second, like you said, with Ruth or anyone else. There's already been some things that have happened that are somewhat scary.
Yes. Okay, Rebecca, are you ready now?
Not
You're on the
really.
spot.
I'll probably think of a really great answer to this in about
Later?
an hour. But speaking of people being able to represent for other people, I feel like Meghan Markle on her wedding day, I'm just going to give her a shout out. Speaking of fabulous fashion, I think
And shoes.
And the shoes.
Good too. Yeah.
I think that sort of, it's very cheesy, but like essentially prioritizing love over everything and realizing the responsibilities and the hatred, frankly, that she got for being who she is. And sort of deciding to say screw it to all those people, to the haters, and really handling a lot of things with poise and grace. And I'm happy for her that she has sort of decided to prioritize her own happiness at this point. So I think that maybe for the inspiration for all the little girls out there who wanted a princess essentially that looked like them, I think that that was just a really powerful moment.
Yes.
Not as serious as a lawyer or a Supreme Court justice. But
Hey, both amazing women, trailblazing, and like that's what we need more of, right? So thank you guys so much for taking this time to chat with me today. Really enjoyed hearing your perspectives, and I can't wait to talk to you guys again sometime.
thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, Dolly.